Well, hello once again everyone and welcome back to Perth South Model Railway. This video is all about how I went about creating the back scene for the railway. Perth has a really lovely location and I always liked the idea of creating my own back scene showing Perth and its surrounding countryside, and I hope in this video to show how I achieved that. Now, if you've seen my previous videos, you will have noticed the uprights at the back of each baseboard. Now these were fastened in place as I erected each board and put it in position in the room because I knew it was going to be difficult to fix anything to the back of the boards once they were in place. So the first thing to do was to seal these uprights, and I've just used neat PVA to provide an impervious surface. Why am I doing that? Well, the method I'm using here is the same as that used by Richard Warren of Everard Junction on his new layout. Now I'm sure you've all watched Richard's amazing videos of his layout, but the process he used was to use Velcro strip, and you need a smooth impervious surface to make sure of a good bond between the sticky back of the Velcro and the wood. Now the backboards themselves are made up of 4 foot by 2 foot white-faced hardboard that I had acquired a few years ago, and I cut these down the middle to form 4 foot by 1 foot boards. Now 1 foot high isn't a very tall back scene, but I was limited by the slope of the ceiling above the layout. It also allowed me to make best use out of the 2 foot wide boards that I had. Now, because the track levels vary around the layout, I decided to line the boards using the top edge to create a level line all the way around. Now that meant that in most of the boards there is a gap at the bottom, but these gaps will eventually be filled with low-level scenery or low relief scenery. Again, following Richard's methodology, I sealed the back of the boards where the Velcro strip was going to be applied, and I also glued on some interlocking teeth at the ends of each board, and this helps to ensure that the ends of the boards are held in alignment with each other. The next stage is to apply the other half of the Velcro tape and stick that on the back of the hardboard. And once that's done, you can fix the board in place. The only problem I've had is that when I try and remove the board, separating the 2 halves of the Velcro is actually quite hard, and because of the nature of the back of the hardboard, it's quite easy for the Velcro strip to be ripped off the back of the hardboard. However, overall it's worked quite well. I recall Richard actually used plywood for his backboards, and I guess that would give a much smoother surface again for the Velcro to stick to. So with hindsight, that might have been a better option. And I've actually reduced the amount of Velcro that I've put on each upright to make it easier to both adjust the board as it's being erected and to take it off should I need to get in behind for some reason. So that got the first straight sections done. The next stage was to look at the corners, and for that I decided to use bendy plywood, which I got off the internet. The only problem was that the bendy board I bought bent in the opposite direction from what I needed, so I actually had to cut the boards, turn them round and screw them together again. So using the same method with Velcro, the bendy boards were bent, put in place, and the other boards linked in with them. Now these curved sections were eventually painted with white primer to seal the wood and provide a smooth impervious surface for the paper prints of the back scene to stick to. Now, during the early months of the first lockdown last year, I was able to take my daily walk along Barnhill, which is close to where I live, and from there you get lovely views over to the west side of Perth. I've got a reasonably good SLR camera, although I'm no photographer and have no expertise in photography. So I took a series of overlapping photographs across the whole scene using my telephoto lens. The thing then was how to take these photographs and create from them a panorama. After a lot of investigation, I decided to buy a program called Affinity Photo. Now, this program costs about £24 and it's really an excellent photo editing program. It does a lot of the things that much more expensive programs do, and most importantly for me as a beginner, the website contains a whole host of how-to videos, which made it relatively easy then to learn to use. Now, I'm not going to turn this video into a photo editing video, but I'll show you very briefly the process I went through to create the panorama and make some alterations to it. Once you've got the program open, the first thing to do is to click Open a New Panorama. You can then add photographs from your own computer. You click the Open button. The photographs will then be shown in the left-hand pane, and you click Stitch Panorama, and the computer will start working then to stitch the panorama together. So it takes a few minutes, but you then get a preview of the panorama. If that's what you like, then you can click OK, and the program will then work to properly lay out the full panorama. Now again, it takes a few minutes and I've cut it short here, but once the main panorama comes up on the screen, the program works to render the image, because you can still kind of see the joins and the mismatches and shading between the various parts of the photographs that went to make up the image. So now we can see the completed rendered image with all the individual photographs merged and toned together, and we can zoom in now and you can see the quality is really good. Now we can move on. Now we can move this image around and start to work in areas where we maybe want to edit or hide or Photoshop parts of the image. For instance, to hide this electrical pole and the overhead wires. But let's start by removing these radio masts which weren't around in the 1960s. Now the first thing we're going to do is create a new pixel layer, which is the layer that we're actually going to do work on. That means we won't make changes to the original photograph. We click at the top Current Layer and below, and you can see here that we've created a new layer to work on. So let's go about hiding this mast. So I'm going to use the clone brush tool to do that, which is over here. I'm going to reduce the hardness of the brush to about 10%. You can actually go right down to 0. And the way this process works is that you have a target area that you want to copy, which is marked by the small crosshair that you can see, and by clicking on Alt, then the crosshair moves to this position, and if I move over to the mast, you can see that the top of the mast disappears. So if I now click on the top of the mast and just gently brush it in, you can do the same over here. Gently remove the mast, and I'm going to do another Alt click here and just take that mask out, and this one. And because I've reduced the hardness of the brush, it gives it a nice soft effect. So we'll do another one here. And there we are. Even things like this terrible telegraph post we can actually remove, I'll give you an example of that. I'll focus on some trees here and we'll basically hide this mask by just copying in more tree. Now when it comes to the buildings behind, again, if you're careful where you can choose your point and move in close, then we can actually use some of these buildings and just hide this mask. And from a distance, once I pull back out, you wouldn't know the electricity mast had ever been there. So the other thing I want to do is crop the picture at the top and bottom to take out bits of the photograph that I don't want and to make it better fit the 1 foot high backboard. And you do this by clicking on the crop tool and then pulling on the grid lines in the usual way. We'll click apply and that gives us a much more restricted height to the view with the same level of detail. To ensure the document is actually the right height for our panorama and will have the correct printer settings, we click Document, Resize Document, and you can see that the existing size is in pixels, but we can change that to inches, and I want the height of my panorama to be 12 inches, so I click that. That lock means that when I resize it, the length will be altered to the correct width for a 12-inch height. So if I click resize and then we click document again and resize document again, you can see that it's changed to 12 inches by 244 inches. The DPI I want to set to 300, and that makes sure that when it's printed out it will be of adequate quality. So again, click resize. So once the document has been resized, then all we need to do is click File, Save As, and you can save the file in the usual way under whatever name you wish. Now that's a very brief summary of what you can do with this program. There are lots and lots of different effects, and as I said earlier, the great thing about it is there are loads of video tutorials. I made a number of other changes, including taking one end of the panorama and cloning it into the opposite end so that the panorama forms a continuous strip, and that has allowed me to continuously wrap it twice all the way around the room. Now the next question was how to get the back scene printed. Now most of the companies that produce back scenes actually offer a service to print bespoke back scenes that you have produced, and the cost of that is pretty much the same as they charge you for buying one of their own panorama sheets. So it's actually relatively good value. I used a company called Scaleology Limited and the quality was excellent, but I'm sure there are many other companies, I know there are many other companies that do the same. So moving on to the process of gluing the print onto the backboard, I'm still very much following the advice from Richard at Everard Junction, and the first thing he did was to apply some double-sided sticky tape to the ends of the board, and the reason for that will become clear later on. Now, to trim the border on the print, I'm using a device I got for doing some wallpapering a few years ago, which is it's like a pizza cutter, it's like a little rotary knife. So let's see how that goes. Steel rule, and carefully line up the steel rule, making sure I'm not leaving any white edge left of the border. Then I roll back the protective sleeve, I'm pressing quite heavily. Run it along the steel rule, and there we have a clean edge. So the next thing I want to do is carefully line up the print. I've already cut off part of the border at this end to make the lining up slightly easier. And I want to just make sure there isn't any, there isn't going to be any bare board left when I'm finished. Now I'm just going to use a couple of weights to hold these down, making sure I don't mark the print, of course. Okay, so that's nicely lined up, and what we can do now, by doing this and then by taking off one side of the sticky back double-sided tape, by sticking this down, I can now remove these weights. The print rolls up, but because it's stuck down at this end, I know that as I stick it down, it's always going to lie true and straight along this edge. Okay, so I'm going to start sticking this down now. I'm using just neat PVA. Richard Everard Junction used a mixture of PVA and something else, can't remember. But I found the PVA seems to work okay. The two secrets that Richard pointed out about this were, firstly, using the double-sided tape, which I've used at this end here. The second thing is to use very, very little glue to stick it down, the absolute minimum. And in fact, if you miss bits, it doesn't really matter, it's not wallpaper. That's a key thing to remember about this. So let's get going. Just got a very little PVA in the brush, and I'll start really eking it out. As long as you can see there's a tiny, tiny amount coming off your brush, then frankly that's enough. Now as soon as you've done a few inches, 6 inches or so, just start pressing it down. The good thing about putting the glue on the backboard is that you'll know if you've done some wallpapering, if you're pasting paper, you end up getting paste on your papering tray, on your papering board, which means the next bit of paper you put down you can end up with wallpaper paste or glue all over it. So by doing it, by pasting the board instead, it makes it easier to come up to the edge without going over and onto the table. It really is a very, very thin layer of PVA. Just as you complete each part, just press it down. And there's so little on that there's not enough to cause a problem with the paper soaking it up and bulging, which is great. Really pushing out the PVA, getting every last drop off the brush. Now when it comes to this outer end, what we're going to do is mark it with a pencil, and then we're going to use another piece of double-sided tape. Just to tightly hold the end of the print down. Just put a last wee spot of glue down this end. It doesn't actually matter if you go into the top of the upper layer in the sticky tape, because that's going to be peeled off, so you'll peel the glue off with it. The other nice thing about using sticky tape at the ends of the print is that, first of all, it really holds the end down, and secondly, as you squeeze the end, A, because you've used so little glue in the first place, and B, because you've got a layer of sticky tape at the end, it means you don't have glue squeezing out the end and therefore smudging onto the print, either this one or the one next to it. Now when it came to the corner boards, I was concerned that if I stuck the paper to the boards and then bent them to shape, that the paper might wrinkle. So I decided to paste the paper while the boards were partially bent, and you can see that I've used a couple of bricks to lift up the ends, and actually this process worked reasonably well. Now, one thing I discovered after the first corner had been put in place, and it's something I should have thought about before, the bendy board plywood that I had used was 5 mm thick, whereas the hardboard was just under 3. So the join between the two was actually fairly obvious, and I was quite concerned when I saw this first corner. So for the remaining 2 corners, I decided to revert to using spare pieces of hardboard that I had, and despite having to bend them, the radius of the bend was such that actually the hardboard was fine, and in those cases I actually pasted the paper on in the flat and then bent it to shape without any problems at all. And you can see that in the other 2 corners. One problem I did have at the final corner was that I discovered I'd actually miscalculated the length of backscene that I needed, and it was a bit short, so I've patched a piece in at the end. In actual fact, most of this corner is going to be covered by a hill at the end of the day, and all that will really be seen is some of the sky. So I'm not too worried about that at this stage, and I'll be able to do something permanent about that when I come to do the scenery in this area. The corners like this one, which has been created using hardboard, I have actually had to screw them in place, and I've put a small screw at the bottom, which again will be covered so you don't really see it. And again, in most of the other back scenes, I've put in a screw not into the board but underneath to just to hold them in place, as I did find that some of them were slipping slightly on the Velcro with their own weight. So just putting a screw in at the bottom every so often just helps support the weight, transfers the weight into the uprights that are fixed to the back of the layout. So overall, I'm delighted with the results of the back scene. I've managed to create a back scene based on Perth that no one else has, and I've managed to avoid some of the pitfalls of having wrinkles and bulges in the paper that can quite often be a problem with sticking paper back scenes onto boards. Now, it doesn't match up exactly with what you see if you go down and stand next to the railway in Perth. And there are areas that don't tie in, like at St Leonard's Bridge, where the road at the moment launches into mid-air. But I'll eventually be able to disguise that with additional overlays and other scenic treatment. And as I said earlier, the gaps at the bottom will be infilled in the same way with scenic treatment. I hope you've enjoyed this video and perhaps learned something from it. My thanks once again go to Richard at Everard Junction, because basically I've used his ideas, and I will finish as usual with a short running session. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.